Okay, welcome everybody to virtual class. I'm going to do the very best I can to make sure that this virtual class is as close to as entertaining as possible as in person. Um, and today we're going to be talking about making appraisal decisions. So far in this course, we've talked about sort of the foundations of what archives are, of where archives came from, and we started talking last week about the appraisal process, how archives are built, slowly accumulated over time. Today, we're going to be talking about the actual process of deciding whether something is going to be ingested into an archive, whether we're going to take something in, say yes to it, or say no, not this time, through a process that we call appraisal. So, as we discuss appraisal, I'm going to be using a methodology that was created by a couple of fellows named Bowles and Young called the black box appraisal methodology. The idea behind the black box methodology is that you don't necessarily need to be a subject area expert yourself. The subject of the archive can be a little bit of a black box to you, but you can still do an excellent and thorough job praising the collection, taking a look and seeing, forecasting how it might be used in the future, getting a sense of what material is worth preserving, is necessary to preserve, what material you can maybe say not now, or we're not going to take that into our archive. Um, as we launch into this conversation, I want to caveat that appraisal is a complicated process. It's emotionally fraught at times, and it can deal with some complicated power dynamics. You, as the archivist, are working with a donor, and you're in a negotiation relationship with that donor of what you're going to take, what you're not going to take. Sometimes that donor will have more power than you. For example, if that donor gives a lot of money to your institution, or conversely, maybe that donor um, has uh, has a collection that you really want to take, but in order to get that collection, you have to accept some other material first that you may be less interested in. This is not that uncommon of a situation. So you have to navigate those power dynamics. Or there's somebody above you at your archive that really does want this material taken, and you only have so much control over that decision. Other times, you as the are going to have way more power than the donor that you're negotiating with, because you have the power ultimately of saying, we're going to take this information and preserve it, make it accessible for the future, or no, we have determined that we will not be taking this information. The reason why Bowles and Young developed this methodology was an attempt to try to systematize this process a little bit, because it can be really emotionally fraught. And if you don't have anything that you can fall back on, um, to be able to justify or argue for your decisions, it can be really awkward and difficult to say no to certain collections or to parts of collections. Um, Appraisal is a process both about considering holistically, like, are we going to take this collection at all? And also, what parts of this collection are we going to take and ingest into our archive, preserve? To what level are we going to preserve those materials? So, this appraisal methodology is hopefully a tool that you can continue to use throughout your career as a way of being able to say, hey, like, it's not about the donor, it's not about the materials, it's about the whole of the institution and its needs and the materials and whether the fit is right. Um, that said, an interesting thing about this methodology um, is that it doesn't necessarily assign like points or values to a judgment. There's not necessarily a oh, you have to hit a certain number of marks in order to warrant being archived or archivable. Rather, Bowles and Young seek to identify as many sort of nodes as possible, is what they call them, of considering what factors you might want to hold when you're deciding whether you could take a collection or what parts of a collection that you could take. So they're not telling you how to do it. They're not telling you at what point a collection like reaches valuable, but providing you the tools and framework to be able to make that decision. Appraisal decisions are also going to be informed by things like mission statements, are going to be informed by very personal relationships. So let's dive in, because there's a lot here. There are many, many notes, and we're going to unpack them all. The appraisal decision, as Bowles and Young format it, is subdivided into three sort of like branches or categories of factors or criteria to consider. First is the value of the information. Second is the cost to retain it. And third is the implications of the recommendation to appraise or to ingest or to not ingest the materials. So here's the chart in its entirety. Like I said, we're going to go into all of this. Uh, every note we're going to touch on to some extent. I'm going to do what I can to keep this light, keep it entertaining, but also keep it relevant and grounded in particular scenarios. We're just going to roll right into it. As we go, I want you to be thinking about how you would determine at what point you would say, yes, we're going to say yes to this collection. I don't necessarily use this methodology all the time for every collection. There are certain collections where it's sort of an obvious yes, um, or an obvious no, or an obvious not our repository, but we'll send you somewhere else. But there are a lot of edge cases where this kind of approach is really helpful. So first, let's talk about the value of information. If you've taken Info 7400, um, you probably heard the word value a lot. In the archival context, there's a lot of different values that we talk about or consider. There's the primary value of an object, which is how it was used when it was originally created. There's the secondary value, which is what value it has in an archive. There is physical value, there's intellectual value, etc. There's many values, is the point I seek to make here. When thinking about on a holistic level what the value of the information of a given collection might be that you're thinking about taking into your archive, Bowles and Young subdivide it into the circumstances of creation, how it was made, uh, your analysis of the content of the collection, and how those records might be used. So first thinking about circumstances of creation, these nodes are all about considering where did these objects come from? Who created it? Why did they create it? What was its original use? Um, what was the position in the organization of the person who originally created it? If you're dealing with a personal archive, like let's say an artist or an author, a lot of the materials will be created by that person. But other materials may be letters that were sent to them, or art shows that were brochures or posters that were created by other people for the artist. Not every piece of a collection is going to come from a singular creator. Very rarely will everything come from a single person. So instead, you're gauging who are the people who are creating this information in the first place. What was their role in the in whatever the archive is focused on? So let's say it's focused on an organization. Was were these materials coming from a marketing team, from a development team, from a curatorial team, um, or on an individual level, was this coming from the artists themselves or their friends, or where did this material come from? Who made them? What was their function? What was their original use? Why were they created? And what can we learn about the process or the organization or their actions through the objects and what we know about how they were originally used. And finally, unit activities reflects what are the actual actions that are being taken on a day-to-day basis by the people who were creating these materials, and do the records that you have in front of you accurately reflect those actions. If it's a publishing house, do the records in front of you reflect the editorial process, the publication process, the vendor relationship process? What's missing potentially from these materials? Can you supplement it, or if not, can you contextualize the records based off of what knowledge you have? So that's circumstances of creation. Next, we move into analysis of content itself. This is sort of the meat and bones of like really digging in and understanding what is this body of information in front of me? What am I looking at here? First, I encourage you to consider practical limitations of the material. Are the materials legible? So are they written in handwriting that you can read or type that you can read? Have they been smudged or damaged in some way? Are they written in a script that is legible to someone? Even if you can't necessarily read it, maybe you don't have the best eye for handwriting, maybe it's in a language that you don't know. But if you think that somebody else can read it, that's certainly a point in that record's favor. And if you don't feel confident that anybody aside from the creator can even make sense of the of what the material says on them, that's a real issue. That's a major concern. Um, and understandability is the flip side of this. You may be able to read what it says, but do you understand what it says? Even if you're not a subject expert. So how much jargon is being used here? How much abbreviations? Like what reasonably somebody who knows only a little bit about your subject area, how much could they ascertain just from reading these records? Um, are they the sort of records that when you accumulate them over time, when you like spend more time with them, might you understand them a little bit better? Or are they just impenetrable at a level where if you weren't working on them originally, then you wouldn't really be able to make sense of them? Next thing to consider here is duplication. Duplication has to do with, is this information that somebody could find elsewhere? And if so, what is the advantage of archiving it in this context? Physical duplication involves, do these records exist in some other form, in some other archive or repository of some kind? So if so, then you may not necessarily need to ingest these materials. We could instead just point somebody to that other repository. If you have a bunch of art magazines, but you see that the publishing house has already created an archive of their own with those materials already, then unless there's annotations or like very specific context around why the donor or the creator of your materials has those objects in the first place, then maybe you don't archive them, or maybe you don't describe them to like quite as detailed a level. And then intellectual duplication has to do with, is the information that's on these records available somewhere else? So even if this literal file doesn't exist somewhere else, can you get the same information from a different resource elsewhere? Um, this person may have copies of memos internally from the organization. And it may be that that organization's memos aren't preserved elsewhere, but the text within those memos perhaps was preserved at a different repository, in which case, just because the literal object itself is unique, the information on it or the value to a future researcher may already be available somewhere else. This isn't to say that it's not worth preserving anyway, but it's a factor to consider with all of these. None of these are deal breakers, none of these are deal makers. but all of them are factors to weigh and consider in the process of appraising a collection. Topical analysis is our final node in the analysis of content. This is the most intensive part of this whole process, I would say. This is where you actually go into the material and you're trying to get a sense of what research value, what research information, what secondary value information these records have. So, Bowles and Young divide these into five categories of time span. What era do these materials cover? Do they have dates clearly noted? Do you have a sense of what time span we're talking about? What is the creator's relationship to the topic? Is this a significant person in their field? If it's not a significant person in their field, is this a contributor in this field, or somebody who has a relationship to the field, who's interested in its preservation? What what where does these records sit in the sort of larger context? If an artist is perhaps less known in a particular movement, let's say a contemporary artist who hasn't had their work exhibited much throughout their career, um, but you think that perhaps years from now, people will be looking at this artist um, uh, or their work embodies something about this cultural moment in or this artistic movement, then you could justify taking those materials even if they're not, the most famous person in the world, right? Level of detail is a thing to consider, could be good or bad in either direction. If there's not enough detail in this collection, if the materials are so scant that there's not a lot of research value to them, then they might not be worth preserving. But on the other hand, they probably won't take as long for you to process. Um, uh, Conversely, if there's too much information in here, if you would have to do a significant amount of weeding out the collection, taking out materials that aren't as relevant, do you have the resources to be able to do that as an organization? Can you describe this collection, arrange it, get it ready for users to a level that you feel confident is reflective of the collection, is going to make the collection usable? If there's too much information and you don't have the bandwidth for it, or you won't have the bandwidth for 20 years, might be something to consider if somebody else could take these materials instead. The character and quality of information, these are the final two factors here. This is what type of information that we're looking at and how relevant is it? How usable is it potentially for a future user? As much as you could forecast as possible. Quite frankly, you're not going to know what's valuable or useful to everyone. And there's a real risk of over appraising, of overweeding during the appraisal process, which doesn't help anybody. Um, uh, but at the same time, I think people often associate quality of information with accuracy of information. And I would encourage you to consider what records say about the creator, about the topic, not necessarily just by what's verifiably true, but what is qualitatively representative of that creator, of that movement, of that topic. Consider the Barbara Rosenthal papers in this context. A lot of the Barbara Rosenthal papers aren't necessarily what we would call material that has a lot of authenticity, focus on authenticity, focus on like creating what's the true historical record of what happened. An H&M receipt is not necessarily going to tell us a lot about the truth of Barbara's life, but it tells us some aspects or natures of her practice. The fact that she accumulated so much tells us a lot about who she was as an artist, what she felt was worthy of saving versus what wasn't worthy of saving. So it's not necessarily just what is literally the information on the object. and the quality or verifiability of that information, um, but what the information can tell somebody, what it says, both on a literal level and on an experiential level. Okay. Those are our two first subnodes in the value of information. Now we're getting into use of the records. This node, we're positioning ourselves to think about how somebody might use these records in the future. Forecasting, um, we know how the records have been used in the past, or we have a general sense of what has happened to these records up until this point in their initial life cycle. Once they enter the archive, they will no longer serve their initial purpose anymore. Correspondence will not be replied to once it is archived. Memos will not be sent out to a company once they've been archived. They have served their original life purpose. Now they will be transformed by being in the archive to having a different use. And this node is where we consider what some of those uses might be. We won't know all of them, but we can think about forecasting as best as possible what might be usable in the future. It's everything could be usable. So you have to make some tricky value judgments here as best as you can. I tend to err on the side of preserve more if you have the space. If you don't have the luxury of resources, then you have to deal with the reality that you have. User interest is our first sub node here, thinking about how much is this collection going to be used versus how much time is it going to take to process it. I've processed collections that took me like a couple of days that probably haven't been used since I processed them, such as a collection of old photos of train stations in Queens. Um, there may be a researcher someday who will use those photos, I hope. But it's entirely possible that they may not be used for another 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. They may eventually get deaccessioned because nobody used them. But it wasn't that much time that I spent working on them comparatively. User interest is subdivided into these categories of clientele, thinking about who is coming to your archive, what information they're seeking, who's not coming to your archive. That could be. Um, if you are, let's say you work at Brooklyn College and you don't have a lot of student users, but you have a collection that comes in that could be really interesting to students. Maybe it's about protests against tuition hikes. Um, do you have the bandwidth to expand your user base? If it's not relevant to the people that you currently serve now, could it be relevant to people within your reach in the future? And then thinking about research trend methodologies. In the example I gave earlier of the artist who's not necessarily so famous right now, might they be famous in the future? Might there be something about their work that may be relevant to a current strain of research or a future strain of research that may be relevant to somebody in the future? So getting a sense of, excuse me, where your field is at, what folks are talking about in could be anthropology, could be local history, could be art history, whatever your discipline that this archive might get used by, getting a sense of what folks are talking about. And is this material potentially down the line going to be usable for folks or of interest to them? And the other factor here in use of records is what limitations you might have, what restrictions there may be on the records themselves. These restrictions can come from the source. This could be that your donor has requested, hey, I don't want this collection available for 20 years because there's materials related to a crime I committed and I don't want to be arrested. It happens. It happens more likely than you would think, or more often than you would think. Um, I've had to deal with a good number of oral histories at StoryCorps where people talk about crimes they committed, and we to the point where we have a process of speaking with them and saying, hey, like You might not necessarily want to release this for a certain amount of time because you could get into trouble if somebody sees this. Alternatively, uh, the source of your records may create some access concerns around private information. If you're thinking about digitizing records, you're probably not going to want to digitize stuff with Social Security information, things like that on it. So any privacy concerns that you have, that could stem from the source, or it could also stem from your repository. Maybe you have a policy around what sort of information you're comfortable releasing versus not releasing. Um, Stuff about people's gender identity or sexuality, while not necessarily illegal, is maybe unethical to make available information about somebody's sexual identity that they've not disclosed in public, certainly while they're alive. Um, uh, and there are thornier and thornier questions that you will have to navigate, both based off of your research or your institution's policies and your users' needs and providing care for everyone involved. Okay, so we've been thinking, there's a lot that we've talked about the value of information. So I want you to do a little bit of an exercise. When I'm done speaking, take 5 minutes, pause this video, and think about the Sardell collection that we took a look at last week. And I want you to consider, based off of your experience sifting through the Sardell papers, what you were able to see. Could you understand the content of what was on those records? Were they legible to you? Were they understandable to you? And what is the quality of information on those records? What was their primary value? How were they used initially? What is their secondary value? How might somebody use them in the future? And then what is their informational value? What's the value that's literally written on the document? And what's the evidentiary value? What do these records tell us about Alice Sardell or the people that she worked with by nature of their existence? So take 5 minutes, think about these questions. Feel free to jot them down or journal them as you will. There will be an exercise at the end of this lecture where I'm going to ask you to think about holistically the whole Bowles and Young methodology and talking about appraising the Sardell collection. So center some thoughts now. Think about what we've already covered in this lecture. Take a couple minutes, and when you're ready, go ahead and unpause. All right, if you're still listening to me, I assume you're ready to move on. So we're going to move toward cost of retention. This covers what is the cost, both like financial, labor, any other sorts of costs associated with holding on to these records, holding on to this information and preserving it in some form in your archive. These are divided into storage, processing, conservation, and reference. Taking a look at storage, how much storage space do you need? What's the amount of storage space that these materials might require? In the context of the Sardell papers, let's say, how many feet are we thinking these materials are? I would guess it's probably going to be somewhere in the like 15 to 20 feet, linear feet. But it depends. Depends on how they're stored. As well as the type of storage is your other factor here. Are you going to be storing these in boxes? Are you going to that are in a temperature controlled room? Do you already have that temperature controlled room? Is this nitrate film that needs to be stored in a freezer that you don't have? Do you have the resources to invest in that freezer? If so, if the materials are particularly larger and wieldy, do you have the space to retain that particular record, that particular object? So think about just like spatially. Do you have the resources that you need to preserve these items, both like the amount of space and any environmental control that you might need to do? around those materials. Next is processing. As you're arranging the collection, as you're organizing it into folders, and ultimately describing the collection in a finding aid or an inventory list in order for it to become accessible to somebody on the other end. I showed you in our first lecture the finding aid for the Barbara Rosenthal papers. That was 150 something boxes. Took about 5 years to process that collection. So it's a lot of time and investment. And Queens College determined in the context of that collection that that work was worth it for Barbara Rosenthal's papers. Processing, in the Bowles and Young's context, they subdivide it into these three categories of level of expertise. What do you need to know about the subject at hand in order to be able to process it? For the Sardell papers, what do you need to know about public health policy in order to be able to arrange the collection logically? You don't need to be an expert, but what level of knowledge will you need to have? And do you have it currently, or do you have the capacity to develop that level of knowledge? Additionally, expertise may involve like the materials themselves, things like handling, especially fragile materials or things like nitrate film. Do you have the knowledge in your institution to be able to process that kind of material and to be able to make sure that it ends up in the proper storage place? Cost of supplies. How expensive is this going to be? If you're going to need 150 boxes, do you have the resources for those boxes? Um, a lot of times when people donate materials, they'll donate a certain amount of money that will go towards processing that collection that can help offset your costs. But not all repositories are going to have that kind of flexibility or budget. So on a very practical level, do you have the storage supplies that you need? Do you have the racks that you need? Do you have, as we were talking about before, do you have the freezer that you might need? Or in the case of VHS tapes, do you have the oven that you might need in order to bake that tape off, in order to separate out tape that may have gotten stuck to itself? If you're curious about baking tapes, we could talk another time about that. And finally, quantity of work. How much work are we talking about here? Alice Sardell's collection is not going to take 5 years, but how much time will it take? And is it a priority compared to other collections that your repository is looking at? Can you invest in that amount of time? Do you feel that that amount of time is worth it? Different collections can be processed at different levels. Different collections will have different needs. Um, it's possible that you only need to describe things at a very, very high level, like a collection level, which will take a lot less time to process. But it's also possible that you'll need less time, or that you'll need more time because you'll need to process at sub-collection level, at folder level. How detailed is your description really going to be? Conservation is next. Again, these are the same categories of level of expertise, cost of supplies, and quantity of work. The difference between processing and conservation is processing is focused on getting the materials into the boxes, getting them organized and arranged, ready to go, ready for a researcher to use them. Conservation has to do with preserving the materials so that they don't decay over time. Do you have the level of expertise to be able to handle things like mold, things like red rot, things like vinegar syndrome? If you're not familiar with any of these terminologies, take a moment to look them up now. They're fascinating. Um, but similarly, you're going to have to be weighing whether you have the knowledge base, whether you have the supplies necessary to do that work, and how much of it do you need to do. If a collection is mostly waterlogged and has a lot of mold growing in it, even if the material itself was really cool and interesting to begin with, it might not be worth preserving. Conversely, you may make the value judgment, even though all of this material has mold on it, it'll take many, many hours to clean. It's so unique and it's so valuable and it's so worth it that we're going to do what we can to conserve that material. Again, there's no rights or wrongs. It's just a matter of evaluating what factors you have, what pros and cons any given collection has as you're thinking about taking it in. And finally, reference work. In terms of as somebody's accessing this material, how much support are they going to need to be able to make sense of the material? In the case of things like cassette tapes, they're not going to be able to make sense of those cassette tapes without a player. And if the archive doesn't have a player, then then you're not going to be able to really provide much support for making sense of that material. Additionally, reference work could be involved with somebody is asking you a question about like, hey, I don't know a ton about this aspect of public health policy. Can you tell me about it? Um, how much knowledge do you need to have in order to be able to help somebody make sense of the collection later as they're using it? And how much of that work do you think that you're going to need to do? How much, like, is this collection going to get used? And how regularly are people going to need to ask for support in making sense of the collection? Because if the collection is only usable if the archivist is holding somebody's hands as they're making sense of it, then it's either not been arranged particularly well, or that collection is not particularly friendly to being archived. Again, we have another exercise here for you thinking about these costs of retention. Again, I want you to think about the Sardell collection and consider, are the materials that you looked at in need of repair of some kind? What has been damaged that might need to be actively repaired? Do they pose a risk to other collections? How difficult might that be to address? So is there active rot or mold that could spread to other collections? Are we at risk of an infestation of some kind? What might you need to learn in order to make sense of the materials? What might you need to know? What might the user need to know? And are there any physical limitations to accessing the materials? This could be something like a tape player. I'll give you that one for free. But also, what other limitations in terms of making sense of materials might exist? So again, take a couple minutes to pause and think about it, and then press play when you're ready to resume. I'm now going to assume that you're ready to resume. So we're going to talk about implications of appraisal recommendations. This could be also described as consequences. What are the consequences of saying yes or saying no? You got political considerations and procedural precedents to consider. First, in political considerations, this isn't necessarily just electoral politics, but also internal politics or organizational politics. Um, you need to consider the source of your accession. Is the potential donor or creator somebody who has power over you in some way? Are they somebody who could make your life difficult if you say no? Or are they somebody who could make your life easier if you say yes? Um, who could open doors for you further down the line if you could say yes? There is a little bit of navigating the sort of social game here in the archival field. How much you want to play that game is up to you, ultimately. I try to be as straight up with people as I can in the appraisal process, including acknowledging power. So if I want a collection from somebody, and I'm hoping that they'll give it to me if I take their papers as well. Then I'll tell them straight up, I'd be happy to take this collection, but I'm also interested in this collection. Um, and I would take your collection if we could also take that collection. Similarly, I feel for my own uh, process that it's relevant and important to acknowledge, hey, we appreciate that you're a donor of this organization, so we're going to take these materials for you as an acknowledgement of our continued relationship and our appreciation of your contributions to our organization. You can make it flowery, but acknowledging those power dynamics, I find is honestly a lot more helpful than pretending they don't exist. So yeah, source of the accession can be the authority and influence that they have over you, and then records assessment discrepancy has to do with if you are taking a look at the materials that you're taking in and who you're taking materials from, and there's a hole in your archive of materials that you haven't taken. If you notice that there's a lot of men in your archive of artists and not a lot of women, you might want to consider for the purposes of your of expanding your mission, of expanding your footprint, of just ethical and responsible work, to think about accepting the work of a woman artist, even if it doesn't necessarily follow the structures or expectations of what you think a record is supposed to look like because you're used to processing men's records. If not the source of the acquisition, there are other stakeholders that could be involved that can influence that can affect your life and influence the appraisal process. There could be, let's say you work at Queens College. If the president of the college gets involved and is interested in certain collection getting added to the archive, it's going to be a lot harder for you to say no. That's just the reality of it. And again, records assessment discrepancy. Other people, um, uh, perhaps your users, perhaps your leadership is interested in filling holes or gaps in a collection. And if you say no then, to a collection that reflects a collecting area they're interested in, you're going to have to explain to them why and really make that argument clear. So that's political considerations. Sometimes you got to take things, even if you don't necessarily see the use or value, because it gets you to the next thing. Procedural precedence as a category instead is thinking about where have you been as an archive, and where are you going? And if you take this collection, what does it say about your repository? What does it say about the types of materials that you take if you say yes to this collection? And what does it say if you say no? If you refuse to take that women artists' materials, then what does it say about your archive? It could say that you're not as interested in the materials of women artists. Whether or not that's a fair interpretation, that's certainly, I think, an interpretation that that prospective donor is going to have of you because you're setting a precedent. You're establishing this is the type of material that we do or don't select. You may recognize that the procedural precedence here covers all of the categories of the other two primary nodes, the value of information nodes and the cost of retention. What this particular the procedural precedence is interested in is for every step of the way that you've taken, everything else that you've thought about or considered as you've been evaluating this collection, what you've determined through those evaluations says a lot about your values and priorities as an organization. And so, whatever you decide, whether it's a yes or a no, says something about you and says something about your organization. So, just thinking proactively about if you take this material, it sets a precedent that in the future you might want to take certain material, or you might feel pressured into taking certain material. If you capitulate to this donor now, they'll there's the likelihood will increase that they'll come back to you later for wanting to give you more records, even if they're records that you don't want. So, third exercise, thinking about implications. Again, consider the Sardell collection from last session. Ask yourself who benefits from these materials being archived in their current condition. Who might benefit? Could it be researchers? Could it be students? Could it be Sardell herself? Who gains? What blowback might the archive receive from accepting these materials or turning them down? Are there political consequences to saying yes to materials related to the Clinton administration? Are there are there consequences to saying no to materials from a former professor at Queens College? And finally, if the archives take this collection, what might that say about Queens College's special collections and archives? Could be good, could be bad. Think about these things. Again, feel free to jot down some ideas or thoughts. Take a couple minutes and press play when you pause this now and press play when you're ready to resume. All right, rounding the bend on this lecture, we're going to be talking about values and the values that archivists strive toward. So the Society of American Archivists has a code of ethics that I highly encourage you check out. It's linked on this slide. Um, their code of ethics covers managing professional relationships and stewarding those relationships as responsibly as possible as a representative of the archival profession, good judgment, showing up with authenticity, providing security and protection for your materials, ensuring that your materials are accessible and usable, that you respect the privacy inherent in some of your materials, and that you honor the private needs of your particular collection, and that you build trust with other folks in your organization or other folks in your field or your user base. Additionally, the core values of the Society of American Archivists include access and use, accountability, advocacy, diversity, history and memory, preservation, responsible stewardship, selection, service, social responsibility, and sustainability. As you're going through the appraisal process, this is one of the most sort of um, values and ethics forward part of your process as an archivist. It's really a matter of making decisions that you have to live by, that can be guided by your ethics, guided by your values. But at the end of the day, you have to live with whatever choices that you make about what you save or you don't save. Um, and I say this not to scare you, but to empower you, that your actions have consequences. You're not an invisible steward in the background, but what you do has a very real impact on history. And that is just as much a good thing as it is a complicated thing. So, is appraisal an art or a science? I would say that practicing the science of it, practicing these sort of methodology exercises, makes the art of negotiating those relationships, managing those relationships, and developing the collections that you want to see in the world easier to do. The science involves understanding the methodology of selecting materials, the tools being used, and the institutional policies and aspirations involved in the appraisal and development of collections. The art of appraisal involves trusting your intuition, developing your sense of inspiration and intuition regarding materials, cultivating conversation and connections with new people, or with old donors, deepening relationships forming a network and community that you can build and rely on again and again and again when you say yes to somebody, or when you say no to them in a graceful way. Um, you're helping to reinforce your network. Um, and finally, the art of selection, building what you want to see in the world, what you want to see preserved in the future.